Hello, good evening, and welcome to Bangalore International Centre. BIC is an inclusive and neutral platform for informed conversation, intellectual dialogue, exchange of ideas, arts, and culture. Today's program is the crisis of drug quality in India, coughing up the truth. In the last few months, there have been two major tragedies in Gambia and Uzbekistan, leading to the deaths of almost 90 children. In India itself, there have been 5 such tragedies since the 1970s. At the heart of the problem is the rule of law and a willingness to regulate the pharmaceutical industry in India under the colonial era Drugs and Cosmetics Act 1940. To discuss this issue, Dinesh S. Thakur and Prashant Reddy T., authors of the book The Truth Pill, The Myth of Drug Regulation in India, will be in conversation with Rajani, Bhat and Samar Halarnkar. Over to the panel.
Good evening and welcome. First of all, I have to tell you about this book and what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about something that affects all of us, which is medicines. And this book has done a fantastic job, I finished it only last night, of taking a microscopic, a very, if I may call it, a drain inspector's view of the Indian pharmaceutical industry. We'll keep our, we'll have a discussion for about, say, 45, 50 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Let me begin first by taking you back to 2016 when Dinesh had filed a public interest litigation in the Supreme Court asking for regulatory reform. That was 2016, wasn't it? Yeah. And the Drugs Controller of India, he already had a reputation by then. The Drugs Controller of India, the Drugs Controller General of India said, and I quote, "We welcome whistleblowers. We have got great respect. But their intentions should be genuine, should be nationalistic." I don't have any comment on this guy. This came 3 years after, 3 years from 2013. It was when Ranbaxy, which was then the lodestar of the Indian pharma industry, had pleaded guilty in US courts to 7 felony counts, including adulterated drugs, falsification of data, and admitted to making false, fictitious, and fraudulent claims to the US Food and Drug Administration, and eventually ended up paying $500 million, if I remember right. By 2019, when Dinesh's story had been chronicled by a US journalist called Catherine Eban in this fabulous book called Bottle of Lies, the CDSCO, which is the Central Drug Standards Control Organization in India, recommended that the government of India take, and I quote, "appropriate action to counter allegations made in the book, which it claimed were based on Dinesh's fiction-filled stories, noting that such allegations had often been made to malign Indian pharma industries due to their strong presence globally." The strongest counter, Dinesh and Prashant, to your work appears to be, from what I can judge from this book and all that I've read, these kind of claims that all that you have written is not in India's interest, is anti-national as it were. So let's begin with that, obvious if somewhat banal criticism. Go ahead.
I mean, well, this anti-national label, it's taken many forms when it's come to the pharmaceutical industry. So originally, when the US FDA started an investigation in 2007 into Ranbaxy, the then health secretary was on the record saying that this is nothing but an attempt by the US pharmaceutical industry to malign the Indian pharma industry because they're scared of competition. And with time, that became the gospel truth when it came to Ranbaxy. And there were also a lot of public health activists in India who bought into that line of questioning, where they said that this is more of US big pharma trying to derail us. And in the last 8 years, as we've seen in this country, everything has become about being an anti-national. So even just as recently as last week, I'm involved in some litigation in the Delhi High Court for some very basic information under the RTI Act on vaccine purchases, R&D development. And Bharat Biotech's counsel came up in that case, called me anti-national, called Dinesh anti-national, the foundation that he runs anti-national. A few months earlier, about half an hour before we had our book launch in Delhi, on Saturday at 6 p.m. on Saturday, we got a notice from the CDSCO, which is headed by the Drug Controller General of India, again criticizing us for an interview that we had given. They hadn't yet read the book because it wasn't out, but the timing at 6 p.m. on a Saturday evening, which bureaucrat sends out a legal notice, and the language in that again was that you are undermining trust in the national regulator. Your wording is, your criticism is hurting the Indian pharmaceutical industry. And therein lies the nub of the problem. When the drug regulator of the country is more interested in defending the domestic pharmaceutical industry rather than public health itself and patients, there is something wrong. There is, like in most countries, trying to prove regulatory capture is actually a very difficult exercise. But in India, we have seen statements of the Drug Controller General and the CDSCO, where initially their mission statement was defined as trying to protect, trying to boost the growth of the pharma industry. So that's one of the problems. The moment the regulator looks at its job as protecting the industry, anything that you criticize about the regulator and its functioning or the industry itself, you start getting labeled anti-national, when all we want to do is to protect public health, because the consequences of a lot of the issues that we have raised here will be felt directly by us, by our loved ones, in terms of the quality of medicine that they are taking.
Yeah, Dinesh, you've encountered a lot of this, I think, in the US as well as here. So what is your view on this whole line of argument that you are often faced with? The fact that this is not in India's interests, what you're doing?
Well, honestly, I think it goes with the territory, right? I think whenever you're trying to sort of hold people accountable, the ad hominem attacks come naturally. I don't particularly sort of worry about them. I think that my work speaks for itself. I don't have to go and advocate for myself saying I'm this, that, and the other. The point, I think, well, first of all, before I go any further, thank you all for coming. I understand today is Tuesday evening. You've taken time off from your schedule, braving the Bangalore traffic to get here. So thank you for coming. The point the question you're asking me is that at some point in time, right, it's not just me. Now I think what is happening is that there is a group of people, some of who I see in the audience today. Priyanka's here. We are seeing reporting from outside of the country, and I'll tell you something really, really interesting, right? So, few months ago, we heard about Gambia, where we had 66 children at that point in time who succumbed to acute kidney injury because of made in India cough syrup. Now that number has gone up to 72. We've had a similar incident in Uzbekistan. We had a really, really good story done by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism about a cancer drug, asparginase. How, an oncologist in Tata Memorial in Kolkata is on the record saying that none of the drugs, or the 5 brands that he uses, actually work. This affects all of us here. It affects you. I have aging parents. My dad's 84, my mom's 79. When they get to that age, they will need medical help. And if we don't think about these things now, how exactly are we going to handle this? I mean, you saw what happened during COVID. Did you know that there was a drug that was called favipiravir? I'm quite certain many of you took it. Favipiravir does nothing for COVID. Absolutely nothing. We've got a medical doctor here. I'm sure she can opine about this. Favipiravir put 760 crores in the pockets of the manufacturer of that drug from your and my pocket. Is that acceptable to you? And if I ask these questions, do I become anti-national? That is the reason why I think this book is important. Read. try and understand. See, you don't think about healthcare when you don't need it, right? When you're healthy, it doesn't bother you. You've got a lot of troubles in this country. Braving traffic, coming to Bangalore International Center is one of them, right? We think about healthcare when we need it, when you have to go to the hospital, when you have to go see a doctor. And I'm sure Dr. Bhat will talk about this. Practice of medicine, in the practice of medicine, quality of medicine is a constant. There are lots of things in our physiology that change, right? Prashant is a different person than I am, than Samar is and Dr. Bhat is. Our physiology is very different. How she titrates the drug and the dosage is very different from person to person. That is what the practice of medicine is. Practice of medicine is not thinking about whether the drug will work or not. If it doesn't work, can I find a different brand to give? That is not practice of medicine. Unfortunately, that is a practice of. There are doctors in the audience today. We'd certainly like to hear from you. What do you think about, including quality of medicine and its effectiveness in your practice? When you prescribe medicine, do you take it for granted the medicine will always work? And how do you compensate for that? I have tons of anecdotal data that tells me how doctors compensate for this. They increase the dosage. They increase the timing. They figure out certain brands that actually work and insist that even if they're expensive, please. You know what? There are lots of people who live in rural part of our country, right? Doctors include socioeconomic, status of a patient in writing prescription. That never should be a criteria when you write medicine. Why do you do that? Why does paracetamol cost 5 rupees on one end and 50 rupees on the other end? Isn't that a responsibility of the drug regulator to make sure that every paracetamol that is made by every generic company has the same standard, same quality? Why is it that if I have to buy, if you undergo minor surgery, if you're given an antibiotic of amoxiclav, that the doctor will tell you, and I don't know if your experience is this or not, but they'll say, take it of a certain brand, because amoxiclav is a very particular molecule, and it doesn't work half the time if you're taken with a different kind of brands. Why does it happen? I don't want this to be a monologue. I'm sorry to be starting out ranting, but that is the answer to the question.
No, your monologue is fine when you're starting, no problem at all. I have to first tell you, because I just want to get Rajani in here to get your perspective of how the medical profession interacts in India with the pharma industry. You were in fact telling me earlier how it begins from medical school. Before that, I just want to tell you, in case many of you I'm sure have not yet read the book, but I just found it remarkable, and all of us who have read it have found it remarkable, of the kind of work that has gone into this book. I think it's taken a few years. I don't know how long this took, but I can see that there are more than 400 right to information acts that were filed across various authorities in India to tease out a lot of the information that's come here. And it's by no means exhaustive, but it's certainly indicative. I think a lot of the information, for example, has come just from 3 states. And these are states which appear to be relatively progressive: Kerala, Maharashtra, and Gujarat. Yeah. So these are progressive states, and from all that you read, the entire drug regulatory system in India is in shambles. Starting from how doctors interact with it, how the drugs are made, the kind of falsification of data, of manufacturing, and fraud, and deliberate fraud that is present through the system is staggering. You have to read this book. So Rajani, in the background of that, let's come back to asking for your perspective.
So I think one of the big differences that I noticed as a student as a student and practitioner of medicine who spent some time in India, then some time training in the US, and then came back to practice in India, is the kind of interactions that one has with the pharmaceutical industry right from our training years onwards. When I trained in my residency and fellowship in the US, I trained in a city hospital, and there was a very clear no free lunches rule. So you didn't have any conferences where there were lunches hosted by pharmaceutical companies, no dinners hosted by pharmaceutical companies, no events, no ballpoint pens with the name of a drug on it. There's nothing which can give you brand recall. There's nothing that can make you feel like you're going to get friendly with someone. That's a nice person. I should help them in their growth, in their career as a salesperson. Whereas in India, it's very different. Your interactions with the pharmaceutical industry start in your postgrad years as you go for conferences and things, because we don't get allowances in our training or in our job contracts for continuing medical education. It's the pharmaceutical industry which plays a very large role in educating doctors about the new developments, about new drugs, about new combinations that are coming in. And that's something that you speak about in the book as well, which is fixed drug combinations, which are very different in India compared to the rest of the world. So the interaction becomes one of dependence very early on. A medical student or a postgrad in training in India is not financially independent. They would want to learn a lot more, and the easiest access for them to greater training is to collaborate with pharma and go to these conferences. It's the pharmaceutical representatives who come and give you information about drugs. Now, these are human beings, they are young people, they would also like to have some more luxuries in their life. They are susceptible to suggestion. We are human beings. It's the same psychology everywhere. There's a nice person who's giving you information. It starts off as a textbook, then it becomes a phone with an app, with videos to train your patients about using inhalers, and then it becomes something more than that. We've all heard about this, and that's what's created an atmosphere of mistrust also about doctors and their prescribing practices. So what you spoke about, Dinesh, about the fact that when a doctor writes an expensive drug, for most of us, it is about getting the right quality of drug for the patient. But in the perception of the public, especially over the last decade, with this erosion of trust that's happened, and the reason for the erosion being the nexus between the medical community and the pharmaceutical industry as such, is that patients now don't believe that when we write a particular drug, it's in their best interest. So there's a lot of issues in the way the relationship between the medical community and the pharmaceutical industry has now, it's transformed into something which is not as it was earlier. There is a dependence. It's an uneasy dependence. And I don't know the way of solving it unless the medical community as well as the general community comes together to look at ways of solving this. As a medical community, I think we need professional bodies which set down better rules about what is allowed and not allowed, or what are the terms of engagement. I know there are laws that are being made about it. But in terms of the general public as well, I think asking more questions of your doctors is the way to go. That, when you ask why this drug versus that drug. You mentioned another really interesting thing, Dinesh, which was about the fact that drugs act differently within our body. I am a pulmonologist and I've worked as an intensive care doctor. You mentioned the COVID crisis. It was a never before seen illness. New drugs were coming in. Many of these drugs were repurposed. They were meant for another illness and were now being used for a new illness. The number of new medications which came into the market, or old medications repurposed for a new indication that flooded the market, was astonishing. What happened was also that the process of research studies being published changed drastically. Things went into pre-publication, being available before peer review, which is one of the most important things as a doctor that I rely on. When am I going to rely on the efficacy of a drug in a study, is whether this study has been peer reviewed. So we saw a churn, and I think what we've witnessed now is sort of the worst coming out. It's probably important and very necessary, because there's a lot of sunshine that's now on all the areas that we need to work on to solve this problem.
So I want to take it back a bit into the whole question of how these regimes emerged in, say, since you mentioned the US and Europe. In both the US and Europe, as you write, there were mass deaths that were the catalyst for regulatory transformation. In India, I think it was in 1937, I think that a whole lot of people died in the US because of adulterated cough syrup. Now in India, that has happened as well in 1972, 1986, 1988. 1988, 2019, and most recently now 2022. So this keeps on recurring all the time. In the US, from what happened in 37, they write, is that it transformed the entire regulatory system so that there never again was a death from that as well. So that clearly doesn't seem to be the case in India. You say that a disinterested citizenry is a problem. Are the lack of expertise in the media also, and our inability to explain the complexity of drug regulation also issues? I mean, the media, the citizenry, and the public at large, that we are just not interested and we don't know enough, and maybe we don't want to know, we're not interested.
Yeah, I mean, everybody here is interested citizenry, worried about drug regulation. But I just give you some examples. From between 1901 to 1962, drug regulatory law in the US changed only when there were mass casualties and mass deaths. And they had several such tragedies which killed a lot of people. Like there was one event in a manufacturing facility where the medicine got contaminated, 400 people died. Then in 1962, there was the famous thalidomide tragedy, where for the world for the first time recognized the value of good regulation, because this drug was approved in Europe. It wasn't approved in the US because of one particular drug inspector, and because the US had brought in certain changes wherein you had to submit better efficacy data, safety and efficacy data after the tragedy of 1937. So while in Europe, this drug caused the birth of in excess of 10,000 deformed babies, in the US there were barely a handful of cases because some doctors had given out free samples. The drug wasn't approved in the market. So that showed us the value of good regulation when it comes to drugs. And post-1962, because the scale of that tragedy, just the deaths of babies and babies being born with horrible deformities, that was enough to catalyze such far-reaching reforms that the superstructure that was put in place in the West was good enough. The problem in India, what we're seeing is that somehow the deaths of even children doesn't seem to be shaking our conscience as a nation. In 2019, about December 2019 and January 2020, there was a case of adulterated cough syrup killing about 11 to 12 children in one district of Jammu. And the issue barely got any press outside of the North Indian newspapers like Tribune and Indian Express, right? It was much later that journalists like Priyanka started looking into it in much more detail and reporting whatever went wrong. And that's what worries us. It's very often, it turns out to be the issue of, who is raising it. So for example, if the World Health Organization raises it, immediately it comes in the headlines, right? And everybody starts taking it seriously. But if these are Indian kids who have died and it's being raised by an Indian newspaper, for some reason, it just doesn't get that kind of traction. So the Gambian incident where, 66 children died has got wall-to-wall coverage in India. But the Jammu incident, there are a lot of people who've never even heard of it, which is, I don't know how, perhaps you should give us your insights on how does journalism work and how does it influence some of these debates? Because in the US, in the first half of the 20th century, they had a really great muckraking culture in journalism and tabloid journalism where these guys really, they would sensationalize stuff, but it was very effective in trying to push reform that was pending for a very long time.
No, in fact, you talk so much about regulatory failure. Drug inspectors who are incompetent, who are corrupt, who don't have jurisdiction, bureaucrats, again, who are incompetent and are not interested, etc. One big aspect is, of course, the failure of journalism, because we just do not have the expertise to do this, A. And B, again, the same disinterest that affects the public at large also affects the journalists. There are very few who actually probe this. In fact, Dinesh knows most, I think almost all of those. There's a handful of them, literally. and one of them is in the audience today as well. So, you ran a remarkable series of investigations in trying to establish how bad things were. They ran a remarkable series of investigations, and this is all investigations that actually journalists should be doing or independent drug authority should be doing, but it took two of them to do it. Prosecutions into pharma industry companies, as I said, using the RTI. So they found tens of cases where, for example, companies were found to be manufacturing non-standard drugs, as they're called, which is essentially, I think, substandard
they fail the quality parameters.
They fail, yeah. So so we'll talk only about one aspect of one thing that they found. Since prosecutions, they found range from a decade to 30 years in any of these cases. They found loads of cases where companies were pleading guilty. And why were they pleading guilty? So I think they went further in to find out why they were pleading guilty. That's because judges were fining them between 7,000 rupees and 20,000. 20,000 is the cap, am I right? That you for the fine, yeah. And the statutory cap. And pronounced imprisonment in most cases that you found till the rising of the court. This is the term,
Simple
till the rising of the court.
Simple
imprisonment, which basically means the judge says, okay, go and stand over there, and you're in prison now, and when we end the court, which may be 15 minutes from now or half an hour from now, then you're free, and that's the end of that.
He could get up for his lunch break and they'd be free to go.
To put that amount of the fine also in perspective, I think if any of you have needed healthcare requiring hospitalization, think of the bill that will come on the first day of hospitalization. So the fine would probably be less than just either the consumables or the antibiotics that you needed on your first day of hospitalization. I'm not even counting investigation charges here.
Yeah, and if I can give you an example of some of these cases where a judgment like this has been passed. This is my favorite example because it's so ridiculous, where antibiotic, azithromycin, which was packaged and labeled as having 200 mg of azithromycin, when they tested it in the lab, turned out that it had only 23 mg, which is about like 12%. And the company initially was fighting it out for 5-6 years in court. And this was the Chief Judicial Magistrate's Court in Pune, where suddenly things, like a lot of cases pending, started getting decided very quickly, because the judge, I think, wanted to clear his docket, and he seems to have offered a solution to the prosecutor, saying that I'll go lenient on the sentencing. So this company pleads guilty. Now, it comes down to the judge has to decide what is the sentence. The law says a minimum of 1 year in jail and a maximum of 2. Now, the judge asks the drug inspector and the prosecutor, is this a serious case, etc. And the drug inspector basically responds saying that, it just means that the patient has to take a little bit more of the drug. It was almost like, chini kam hai. You just add another 2 cups, like another 2 spoons of sugar, and the patient will be fine. And the judge says, okay, fine, so simple imprisonment till the rising of the court and a fine of some 20,000 rupees. And this is a broad spectrum antibiotic. If a doctor was to give it to a patient with a life-threatening infection, the patient would die. So this is just how cavalier the entire system is when it comes to dealing with substandard medicine.
I think this is a really, it's shocking that we don't understand what the dilution of quality of drugs can mean for all of us. We're on the verge of we are already in the midst of a huge healthcare crisis of antimicrobial resistance in India. India is home to, I'm going to say it's about 25% or a third of the tuberculosis cases of the world, and we are home to half of the drug-resistant tuberculosis cases of the world. Most of the times, as you mentioned earlier, Dinesh, that as a doctor, I'm thinking of what is this patient's weight, age, liver function, kidney function, side effect profile, all of that when I'm picking the right drugs for the patient. And then I also have to follow the national guidelines for it. I'm not thinking of the fact that a drug that I prescribe has only 12% of what it says that it should. If it has only 12% of the active ingredient, it's not going to work. Secondly, it's going to increase the chances of more drug-resistant organisms, and that's going to affect the future generations of our country. I mean, we're seeing far more drug-resistant tuberculosis than we ever did. What you mentioned earlier about journalism also is that one of the promising trends that I think has been the number of books, the number of journalists who have been picking up these subjects and making it easy for, bringing it to more people in easy to understand language. We've recently had a book about the hidden pandemic of tuberculosis. We have your book. There's been a lot of very, very courageous reporting in the last 2-3 years. And again, that's another thing that, in every crisis, there's an opportunity. So hopefully COVID brings out a lot more for us to work on with that.
I was just wondering if you could quickly explain to people the whole question, and they refer to it a lot in this book, the whole question of the efficacy of a drug, that many of these investigations, the ones that have worked by drug authorities, have found that a drug is only marginally effective because the active ingredient is only whatever, 15%, 20%. So could you just explain that to the audience of how does that actually affect the healing process?
I don't know if...
No, take it.
So, when we take in a drug say in an oral form, we're taking in the active ingredient of the drug along with other substances that are used to make sure that the drug is stable through the entire process of it being manufactured, stored, transported, given to us up to a certain time. When a doctor gives you a medication, they'll sometimes give you instructions like this is to be taken before food, this is supposed to be taken after food, this is supposed to be taken with a fatty meal, instructions like that. That's based on what we know from the tests that were done first on animals, then on human beings, about how this drug will be metabolized in your body, where you take it, it goes into the stomach, an acidic environment. Is it meant to be absorbed in the stomach, or is it meant to be absorbed later on in the intestine? From there, it is going to be absorbed into your bloodstream. That's where we are looking at the therapeutic level of the drug to reach a certain point. Sometimes it's going to take 2-3 doses before it reaches a steady state. Then it'll go in your bloodstream to the diseased area and act on the bugs or act on the receptors of the body or the organ in the body where I want this drug to work. So there is the efficacy of the drug is not just in terms of the active ingredient in the pill, but in how it is metabolized in the body and how much of it actually reaches the site where it is supposed to work. And that's where all these quality regulations come into play. What is used in terms of the materials and the regulation of the processes and storage, transport, all of those things. I think, Dinesh, maybe you can help me out with explaining.
No, I think, so from a pharmacological point of view, I'm not a trained medical doctor, but I've worked in drug development. I understand the science a little bit. Not every drug acts in a similar way, right? If there's anybody in the audience who works, in either mental health, if anybody is in the audience who takes medicine for hormonal changes, if there's anybody in the audience who has thyroid indication and takes TSH replacement therapy, small changes in their concentration in your bloodstream have a very large effect in the way that the therapy actually works. What Dr. Bhat talked about here was how does a drug gets metabolized and gets into your bloodstream. The reason why doctors tell you take this drug once a day, take this drug 2 times a day or 3 times a day, depending upon the formulation, is because there has to be a certain concentration of that drug in your body in order for the therapy to work, right? And depending upon the kind of drug that they give you, that's why they tell you take it 3 times a day with meals, right? Sometimes they say take it once a day because it has the ability to actually stay in your body much longer. The half-life of the drug is much longer at that point in time. If instead of 200 milligrams of azithromycin, which is prescribed for upper respiratory infection, you're getting 12%. Imagine how much drug is in the body to try and treat your upper respiratory infection. It's not going to work, right? Likewise, if you are dealing with this class of drugs that are called narrow therapeutic index drugs, which are, as I mentioned to you, mental health, TSH replacement, hormonal changes, anything that's used in the critical care settings, small changes in the availability of the drug in the body have very large, effects that you see. In fact, my colleagues and I had done a study on a drug called budeprion. Wellbutrin was the brand name of the drug. And the way that the drug actually it's used in, mood disorders and in mental health settings. We demonstrated to the US FDA through our analysis that generic formulations of this drug that has different concentration in the bloodstream when given compared to the brand actually have significant effect on the mental health of the patients. Now, based on that information, the US FDA changed the definition of what is called bioequivalence. I don't want to be technical here. The point I'm trying to tell you is that there are certain classes of drugs that, this is very tricky. Then there are certain classes of drugs that, you're taking paracetamol, if you get a little bit less of it, you can make an argument that, it's an analgesic, I'll try and take more of it to try and compensate for it. It doesn't work every time. The problem that we see in India is it's not about a brand or a company. It is the variation between batches. So you can actually go buy a medicine from the chemist shop this month, and it'll probably work just fine. Next time when you go to get a prescription refill, you will get it from the same manufacturer, a different batch that does nothing for you. And the trouble is, if you go back to the doctor, I don't know how many of you actually had this experience, you go back to your physician and say, look, my medicine is not working. 9 out of 10 times I'll tell you we'll change your prescription. How many times have you asked, why are you changing my prescription? What was it that made you write the prescription the first time? And now you're writing a different prescription for me. How many times do we really ask that question? And if you don't ask that, what is the incentive for the doctor to even think about this thing and say, look, you know what, there's something really wrong here? Because the same prescription last month was fine, right? And in this month, if the patient is complaining about this, I should be doing something different. And 9 out of 10 times the doctors don't really have the capacity to do this because there's a line of patients waiting outside,
There's another point to add to what you said about different batches of drugs being slightly different from one from another. In the last year or so, if any of you know of patients who have been using a drug called varenicline for smoking cessation, it's been recalled because of something that they found in terms of the quality. And now this is a really useful drug that many of us were using for our patients. And patients are anxiously asking me all the time, when is it going to come back? Well, it's been recalled, and until the company can give us the assurance that the future batches are now going to be fine without this metabolite that was not acceptable in the last batches that were coming out, it's not going to be available in the market. So it's important in terms of self-regulation of the pharmaceutical industry that when a batch is not okay, they call it back and say, too bad, this drug's not available for the last several months now. From what I understand, it's not going to be available for another 6 to 8 months. But it's not like someone is putting a low-quality product out there. That's a very essential, that actually strengthens my trust in that particular product far more, rather than this variability that one is seeing right now.
I'd like to, if I may now, like you to discuss the whole drug regulatory process in India, which is, each chapter in this book really is like a 2-hour discussion. It is so complex. But if I were to distill it, you say basically that corruption plus poor regulatory design are the major reasons. There are 38 authorities across states and union territories, plus the CDSCO, who are regulating drug quality, if I'm right. Inspection reports are not made public. There's little information sharing among state drug controllers, who often seem to function like national authorities, virtually. And if there is someone dies in Himachal Pradesh, it's very difficult from someone from Tamil Nadu to actually go and inspect those facilities. And Himachal Pradesh obviously doesn't want to do this because they're trying to protect their pharma industry, these kind of things. The other thing I found was, of course, that there was a quote that you have in your book from the Bombay High Court, which it made about these remarks, scathing remarks against the entire Maharashtra Food and Drug Administration, which is supposed to be one of India's most progressive, by the way. And I'll just quickly read this out. The judge said, I conclude that the Food and Drugs Department and its officers, right from the cadre of food inspectors to joint commissioner, do not have any legal knowledge, legal skill, and seriousness with which the provisions of these acts concerning human health is required. They are casual, callous, and hardly concerned. Relevant and concerned provisions, amended provisions of Code of Criminal Procedure are not even known to them to make use thereof. And then other thing I found remarkable was that in the book, one of the most incisive investigations of the rot in the approval process, for example, of new drugs, came from a committee of 31 members of parliament in 2012, which was, I found, really remarkable. So tell us about this. What exactly is going on here? It sounds like this is a whole bunch of people who know very little about what they're doing. This is what you write. I don't really write. I'm just putting it into one sentence.
Well, I mean, that's a very open-ended question that you asked me. But I mean, let's discuss some good news, right? So that Parliamentary Standing Committee report. So, as all of you may know, there are about 25 or 30 department-related parliamentary standing committees in both, which has members from both the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, and they have oversight over specific ministries in the government. And these are committees which have powers to, call, summon bureaucrats, look at records, etc., etc. So in 2012, about 10 years ago, there was this one committee on health, which is generally populated with doctors, MPs who are doctors. And we don't know till date what got into them, but they did such a brilliant investigation into the functioning of the CDSCO, and they were so scathing in their remarks. They openly called the CDSCO collusive. I think they hinted at corruption. They pointed out missing files, non-responsive bureaucrats. And they painted such a vivid picture of how dysfunctional the system was that we used that as, the starting point for even our book. So it's a great example of how, despite our cynicism about committees and commission of inquiries, there are instances where some of the stuff works. Like in 1988, when there was another one of these, DEG poisoning events at JJ Hospital in Bombay, there was such an outcry in the media at that time that the state government was forced to set up a commission of inquiry under a sitting judge of the Bombay High Court called Justice Lenton. And that judge produced such a fantastic report, the Lenton Commission report, where he just went into so much detail and dug out so much dirt that the health minister had to resign after that, the state government health minister. So, there are committees like this which, can do a far better job in trying to find out what is wrong. The problem with people like us trying to do similar work from outside is just, getting access to information, which was the biggest challenge. Thankfully, that standing committee also they forced the government to put a lot of information out in the public. Like a lot of these committees put their information out into the public domain. Now, regarding the problems, if I can just give you one example of how broken the system is, where they knew what was wrong and they still didn't try to fix it, is something called a recall system. That is, when you know that a drug has failed testing, because there are drug inspectors across the country who are randomly conducting testing by purchasing drugs from the market. Now, when you know that a drug has failed testing, you would think that from a public health perspective, the bureaucracy would go all out to try and recall the entire batch of that drug from the market. Now, when we started researching this, we realized that discussions regarding a national recall law started in 1976, and this is there in government records. Every decade, it comes up once or twice in a couple of government committee reports. And till date, we don't have, it's been 46 years. A lot of us are younger than that. Till date, we don't have a single law on national recall of contaminated drugs. And this is not a theoretical policy issue. There are very real-life consequences to this. For example, the Jammu case, which we discussed earlier, where 11 children died because of that contaminated cough syrup, the national regulator CDSCO basically dealt with it in a very cavalier manner. They just wrote to all the state drug regulators and said, oh, withdraw this batch of cough syrup from the market. What they didn't do was a detailed investigation to see how many other batches and how many other brands at the same facility use the contaminated ingredient to make cough syrups. As a result, 8 months later, another 2-year-old child from Badi in Himachal Pradesh had consumed a different brand of the same company, the cough syrup, and passed away in the hospital after fighting a very painful battle for 2 months because it causes renal failure, etc., etc. So there is a cost to a lot of these policy decisions where bureaucrats are just dithering. I mean, if you wanted to just enact a national recall law, it's not that difficult, but the reason they don't want to do it is because one of the common foundations of any national recall law will have to be a system of widespread publicity, right? Because that's the first step of any public health crisis. You need to let the public know what happens. And there are individual instances of doctors in India who have gone to the press themselves and tried to get the message out. But the bureaucracy in India knows the moment that you have a compulsory law like this in India, and the public has to be notified every time, and doctors, that you're going to know the scale of the problem. That is, every week there are going to be 10 alerts. And that's the reason they don't want to push for substantive reform. So this is a case of bureaucratic procrastination, which is guided purely by malice, almost.
It's interesting. I mean, I don't know how many of you actually paid attention to this, but when the Gambian incident happened in October, the initial response from the ministry was that, oh, these cough syrups are not sold in India, so you guys don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, I remember that.
Right? Why do they do this? They do this because they want to tell everybody else that, they don't have a legal basis to try and take a regulatory action, right? There is no law, there's no force of law, right? And they don't want to try and cause panic saying that, okay, if the same drug is and available in our local markets here, there's going to be panic in public. So it manifests in very weird manner the fact that 46 years, every couple of years, it comes up at the Drug Consultative Committee meeting. And unfortunately, these are statutory body meetings, right? So there are documents. There are minutes of the meetings where they say, we have discussed this. And they'll form a subcommittee to go investigate that. The subcommittee comes back several years later saying, we have to do this. And then nothing happens. And we document this in a chapter, how many times we actually go through this analysis. And even today, right? Priyanka wrote a really detailed piece about a drug called remdesivir that was used during COVID. This drug was, this particular instance is a drug manufactured by a Gujarat-based company, administered in Bihar, and it was contaminated, and people died because of that. In spite of that, there's never been a recall of that drug in this country. Now tell me, how is this acceptable?
So this would be an expensive process for companies when they have to do a recall. Now, if I think of it in terms of some of my patients who have sleep apnea, who use a CPAP machine, I don't know if there's anyone in the audience who uses one of those machines, but recently one of the large medical device companies had to do a recall of an entire batch. And this is like all the equipment, all the machines that were manufactured over several years, because there was one part that they were using in the mask, which they found potentially carcinogenic in a really small percentage of patients. But that led to a worldwide recall with a promise of replacing every device for every patient using it. But this is what is essential. We have to take this seriously, because what you mentioned about one more 2-year-old dying 8 months later, that's a preventable death.
Yeah, and the thing is, Indian pharmaceutical companies conduct recalls like this all the time from the American market. Like recently, last week, you may have read in the news, there were contaminated eye drops, which contained, for some reason, antibiotic-resistant bacteria that ended up killing one patient, and I think a few others lost their vision. Now, this company has announced a recall from the American market. There's a very high possibility that this company is catering even to the Indian market. It's unlikely they're not selling anything, but we don't hear anything. Even these cough syrup cases, the Gambian company, we know they do business in India because their website makes it clear. We've seen prosecutions of this company in India earlier. It's possible they're not selling the same 4 brands that they were selling in Gambia in India, but they're definitely selling other brands because we found trademark registrations, etc. in that. So there should have been a public health response, right? Because you can't just wish this away and say that, oh, it's only African kids who are dying. But the callousness with which this is dealt with, and a lot of it goes back to the first issue that we discussed, Samar, that is the reputation of the Indian industry is what the regulator wants to protect. Because there, to some extent, there's a political message that has gone down the chain of command, wherein you're more interested in protecting the reputation, which is why we're more comfortable blaming this on anti-national elements or conspiracy theories of WHO acting against Indian interests, etc., etc.
Before we open it up to the audience, just one more question, a rather long one. You're right. In our opinion, the heart of the problem in India, with the wide availability and sale of dubious drugs of doubtful safety and efficacy, is not just an indifferent regulator, but also the lack of widespread understanding within the Indian medical community of evidence-based medicine. Now, to me, there's no better example than this, of course, is the whole question of colonial during COVID. When Baba Ramdev, the yoga guru, one day suddenly stood up and said, I have a cure for COVID, if I recall right. And he said that we will now, we have done clinical trials and we will now sell this. And the government of India, there was some protests. I think there was some feeble protests as far as I remember. And basically, they tried to restrain him. But finally, they said, okay, when he said, okay, this is maybe not a cure, but it's immunity booster. And it slid to that. And finally, the health minister publicly appeared with him, side by side with Baba Ramdev, to release these so-called clinical trials. And the IMA, the Indian Medical Association, and others criticized this fiercely. But at the end of the first wave, I think he had, according to the book, about 250 crores worth of drug, colonial, had already been sold. The whole question of evidence-based medicine in India and why it is such a problem to push and accept in the Indian medical community itself. Why is that? Given that we are so well known for the doctors we churn out, the fact that we export them across the world, to the West, etc., and they're practicing, they're absolutely fine. So what exactly is happening here? Rajani?
I do think there is, I do think that observation is perfectly on point, that we do face a crisis of, not enough adherence to evidence-based medicine. Part of it has to do with the medical education system, which is now going through a period of reform, I think, since 2018, when there have been a lot of changes made to the medical curriculum with introduction of, far more subjects in the curriculum, including ethics, including communication, including a whole lot of things that were not there earlier. I think earlier it was just about treating diseases. Now we look at the idea of a doctor's work as addressing health and all the other issues that come with it. The social determinants of health, knowing about clinical trials, knowing about the ethics of clinical trials, and knowing that everything, that science is about questioning things and not just accepting what's in a textbook. So this is a mindset shift that's happening. I'm not saying that it wasn't there earlier, but we are a country which has a huge shortage of doctors. Our medical colleges have been churning out doctors who can treat simple diseases, disease syndromes, and things like that. But the kind of questions that we're looking at now and the rate at which data are generated, or research is coming out about different, it's really difficult to keep pace with the speed with which evidence is coming at doctors. So we need to teach them how to, it's similar to trying to figure out for an average person about what's the news that's coming in on WhatsApp, right? How credible is something that's coming on WhatsApp? Even when we look at research that's being presented to us, when it's coming from a peer-reviewed journal, Is it a high quality peer reviewed journal? Is it a predatory journal? Is it a journal where you can get your article published just by paying some money? In the research circles, we used to call it, is it something that was published in the Journal of BS? So, just because you needed to get, these are really important questions, because, if you are a professor, tenure, you need to be publishing. What are you producing? And are we teaching this critical thinking quality to our medical students to be able to discern that? You mentioned about favipiravir and all of those things, right? Hydroxychloroquine was another big one. So many drugs that came up. I feel very, very happy that I did not prescribe any of those through 3 years, right? But it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to say that, no, I don't have the evidence to do it. When we talk about people prescribing unnecessary drugs, it's sometimes because of the pressure of wanting to do something rather than do nothing. Okay, we really are do something is a very strong impulse for medical professionals. That's one big issue. The other is also about following certain set practices. We've talked about cough syrups a lot today. Cough syrups are one of the least important things in the management of cough. In fact, they are practically useless. I studied cough. A lot of my postgrad research was in cough. My mentors have written the guidelines for acute and chronic cough, the most accepted guidelines. You won't find cough syrup in those guidelines.
Yeah, India
Yet, if as a doctor, someone comes to me with a cough, I have to explain to them, I am not writing a cough syrup, because they expect it. So I think the practice of evidence-based medicine will require instilling this kind of critical thinking right from an early age to say, no, I'm not prescribing this out of any pressure, either from the market or from a patient or from my internal need to do something rather than spend time and counsel a patient on what's necessary to be done for this illness.
If I can just add to that, at least with colonial, Samar, the Indian Medical Association, stood up and took the government head on. That observation that we made of, the Indian medical community doesn't understand evidence-based medicine was in the context of a lot of these other drugs that don't have a market anywhere in the world but India. And there's this fantastic medical editor in Delhi, Dr. Chandar Gulati, who edits, I forget the name of the journal, but he used to track a lot of these cases. And if I can give you one example of how absurd it is, there's this drug called buclizine, which was originally approved as an antihistamine, that is for allergies. In India, for some reason, it got approved as an appetite stimulant for children. And this is when doctors say that lack of appetite is not a disease that can be cured by drugs, right? So it was likely that the drug, one of the side effects of the drug was weight gain or something like that. And there were Indian doctors who did some studies, to see what was the underlying evidence. And they found some obscure journals written in French, literally written in French somewhere, which documented some crazy evidence. But this drug got approved in India. It was selling for more than 10 years, even after the Parliamentary Standing Committee that we discussed raised a ruckus about it. There was an inquiry committee which was constituted. That inquiry committee report went missing. That drug approval file went missing. Then finally, Dinesh went and sued the government in the Delhi High Court. Within 1 week, they banned the drug as an appetite stimulant. It's still sold as an antihistamine. But there are a lot of crazy examples of, fixed dose combinations and other drugs where they're not sold anywhere in the market. And why are Indian doctors then prescribing them? That's where the medical community in India starts losing trust from patients.
Yeah, there's no shortage. I mean, I have just so many questions, but I have to stop you here clearly. But except to mention just one thing, just to follow up on what you were saying. It boggles the mind, the kind of things that Indian companies are doing. You talk about, for example, the large-scale faking of data to prove the efficacy of generic drugs that are exported. India is the pharmacy of the world, of course, as we proudly call ourselves. But one of the worst, recurring allegation that they found, for example, among some of the worst offenders, was the regular routine fabrication of ECG data. I mean, who and why are we, would someone fake ECG data just to prove the efficacy of the drug? Anyway, I'll stop at that. We'll open it up for audience questions.
My name is Dr. Jagdish Chinnappa, and I know Rajani pretty well. So, wonderful conversation. I would just like to bring about a couple of things. The first thing is on evidence-based medicine. To generate evidence, you require research. And to do research, you need money. And unfortunately, in this country, there is no money to do research of anything, of any kind. So there is no evidence. So what is a practitioner going to do? He is going to practice the best possible evidence, imported from Gambia or imported from the US or imported from the UK. So that has to be fixed first. That unless you have evidence, you cannot do anything. The second point which I wanted to bring is regarding cough syrups. And we discussed about JJ Hospital and Linton report and etc. So I was in JJ at that time. And I'm a practicing pediatrician. And I can say only one thing is, yes, we have no evidence that cough syrup works for the majority of coughs, but we have a subsegment of coughs where it does work. And there we have to know when to use a cough syrup or when to use a medication for cough. So I think that is very important. And as a practicing pediatrician, if I see 40 children in a day with cough, I would probably prescribe a cough syrup in maybe 4 or 5. So I think that discretion has to be there. The third point which I wanted to bring about is the IAP, the antimicrobial resistance. And I think the major problem here is the government has just not regulated the use of even the most complex antibiotics. You can get ofloxacin, you can get any kind of antibiotic across the table from a pharmacist. You don't need a doctor to prescribe. So I think the important thing here is that regulation of antibiotics should be strictly according to the usage, especially WHO aware classification, which unfortunately is never done here. So I think the more important thing is that the government has to regulate that first. Final point which I want to say is that though we have been bashing pharma from the whole evening, we must congratulate the pharma for a large number of the medications that are available in this country at a cost that is affordable by our population. You go to the UK, the same drug will cost you at least 10 times more per tablet, or the US. At least we have drugs available. I'm sure Rajani will agree with me that if you have an inhaler which is going to cost you 200 or 300 rupees here, in the US it will cost you nothing less than 3,500 to 4,000 rupees. So I think, and it just not be available also. So I think we must congratulate the pharma in India for at least getting these drugs across to a population who cannot afford all those costly alternatives. So these are some of my points which I wanted to bring up.
Thank you. You've made some really important points. This is not the book is not an intent to try and bash pharma. I mean, clearly, look, medicines is the first line of defense for our country, right? We are in Bangalore, access to really good hospitals. Large population of India lives in rural India. And the farmer who falls sick doesn't have access to primary health care, walks up to a medical store and says, please give me something, I have a headache, right? Medicine is a first line of defense. We're not trying to put medicine down. What we are saying is that, look, what good is it if the medicine that you're buying with the meager money that you have doesn't really work? True. Right? That is the point we're making.
Point taken, sir.
Right?
Thank you.
Second point, I think this is really important because this is one of my pet peeves. One of the things that we've been trying to do, and Gayatri is in here someplace, we've been trying very hard to try and encourage research within academic institutions in this country. We provide grants and things like that. It is next to impossible to try and provide a grant to this country. And even if you give money, institutions don't deliver. I'm sorry, but this is the reality, my lived reality. I've been trying to do this for the last 3 years. Even after providing a grant, we do not expect good quality research. That has to change. And you have, as members of the medical community, through the professional organizations like IMA and MCI, or the replacement of MCI at this point in time, you need to address this. Because you're right, evidence in the US is for the US conditions. Evidence in India, what you deal with here, has to be ours. And if we don't do this, we end up copying stuff, a lot of clinical guidelines from US and UK, which may not necessarily apply to us. Right?
If I can just add to that, thank you, Doctor, those are all relevant points. We get this question a lot, why are you bashing pharma? Why didn't you include a chapter on how great the pharmaceutical industry has done? But the point of writing the book is to show that there are systemic issues, right? So we're not going after one company or the other company, but we need to acknowledge, and even the medical community has to acknowledge, that there are systemic issues with drug regulation in India, which is why so many of these players are getting through the cracks. On the second issue on pharmacists, we've got an entire chapter on that, and that's a different horror story of how the supply chain is regulated in India. And the fact that a lot of pharmacies in India don't have registered pharmacists. Even a prosperous state like Maharashtra, their state drug controller confessed at one of these meetings that 30% of the pharmacies in Maharashtra don't have registered pharmacists, which is very scary because in India, most people treat the pharmacist as the doctor. So if it's not a very serious ailment, a lot of people will go and ask the pharmacist to prescribe something for them. And the problem with the pharmacy sector, as you may know, is it's very disorganized, a lot of small mom and pop businesses, very difficult to regulate. That, I presume, will change over the next 10 years as more of these big corporate chains get into building pharmacy chains across the country. As it gets more corporatized, I think it will get a little bit more professional, even when it comes to issues like storage. Because a lot of pharmacies in India today don't even have air conditioners. And if you're in, say, in a Bombay, Kerala, Chennai, in summer, with high humidity, high heat, those drugs are not formulated to remain stable in those kinds of conditions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
So, hello. Good evening. My name is Rahul. So, one thing I learned today is that there are no laws for drug recall in India, but...
Do please introduce yourself.
My name is Rahul. I am a clinical programmer working in specifically cell and gene therapy in the oncology therapeutic area. So, my question might seem a little redundant given that India doesn't have proper laws regarding conventional medication. So, it's a little far-fetched to think about immunotherapy and so on. But are there talks or is there a framework related to cell and gene therapy specifically in India?
No. I mean, we've not even put in place a decent system to regulate biosimilars. And biosimilars have now been around for about 20, 25 years. And we keep seeing some, scandals. They don't get too much press. But basically, there's one section in the Ministry of Health called the Drug Regulation Section. So they are the ultimate masters of policy making when it comes to the pharmaceutical industry, when it comes to the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. The Drug Controller General of India himself doesn't have any powers to formulate policy or make rules. And the Joint Secretary who heads that Drug Regulation Section is generally a civil service officer who the previous year may have been doing something else randomly, and they drop him in this section to suddenly make very complicated policy without much support in the way of experts to help him out, etc., etc. So the policy making process in the Ministry of Health is fundamentally broken because nobody's trying to fix it at all. They are still in the 40s era where medicine and technology was in a completely different framework. And as far as we have seen, there's been no attempt to try and modernize this entire system of how policy is made within the Ministry of Health. So, yeah.
Rahul, if I could just give you a simple anecdote, right? And doctors here probably know, we have a lot more devices today in the practice of medicine as compared to what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. Our laws treat devices as drugs, okay? And devices, there's a lot more engineering in devices, right? I mean, a knee replacement is not the same thing as giving somebody medicine. But law as it's written right now, there is no distinction between a device and a drug. That's where we are.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all the work that you do. Thank you.
So my name is Melissa, and I have two questions. The first one is really in response to your book. Besides the CDSCO notices that I've read, what was the response of the Indian industry to your book? And the second one really is, you had references to the US in contrast to India. But if you look at Catherine Eban's Bottle of Lies, it's as much about the US industry as it is about the Indian industry, because, you know, in their rush to push generics out into the market, substandard drugs flowed in. So how different is it then?
Good. You take first, I'll take second one.
Well, I mean, the Indian industry has actually not responded to our book so far. We're just hoping it's not in the form of a lawsuit at some point. I mean, which is why this book is so heavily referenced, to the point of almost making it a bit difficult to read. But yeah,
sorry, you did say that it was born of a serious fear of being sued.
Yeah, no, so just to give you some context, when we started writing the book, one of the things that was hanging over our heads was the fact that anybody who has criticized the drug regulator and the pharma industry has received threats from the government of India. So to give you an example, in 2014, there was this bunch of American and Canadian academics who had done a study on the quality of Indian medicine sold in Africa. First response of the government of India was, we'll sue you for defamation. The industry lobby and the government of India. When Catherine's book came out, the drug regulator sent a note to the Ministry of Health saying, let's take legal action against this book because it's filled with whatever fiction, lies, etc., etc. So that was something that was hanging over us when we wrote the book. So I think we have overcompensated in some of the referencing that we have done, but that's a problem with trying to write books like this in India, because you never know when a judge is going to give an injunction. So a lot of contemporary non-fiction books in India, or even cinema for that matter, like Netflix's Bad Boy Billionaires ran into litigation. Some book about, I think, Baba Ramdev ran into litigation. Tamal Bandyopadhyay's book on something, I think Air India or something, ran into litigation. So writing non-fiction in India on contemporary subjects it's a landmine. But let's see what the industry says. I have a feeling some of them are going to agree with what we have said, because historically we've seen cases, I mean, from what we've learned from Europe and the US, is that the pharma industry does want some level of regulation, because then if you risk too many bad players in the market, then it becomes tough for private enterprise to succeed. And with this Gambian tragedy and this Uzbeki tragedy that's happened, there are off-the-record conversations that we've heard of where the pharma industry is saying that, oh my God, you have to do something to rectify the situation and just stop hiding behind nationalism. But given the present media environment, I don't think they're going to speak out too boldly. You want to answer the second question?
Yeah, so you're right. I think that, industry actually doesn't matter whether it's United States, Europe, or India. It always pushes the envelope. I don't know of any other way to try and explain this to you. But let me tell you what happened after 2013 when the Ranbaxy case broke and, I kind of became a public persona at that point in time. There are two organizations of the US government. One is called the Government Accountability Office, which is very similar to what we have, the CAG in this country, right? The Government Accountability Office essentially engaged with me through multiple years, and they basically made changes to the way that the US FDA does foreign inspections. They changed, see, initially, the reason why Ranbaxy happened was because they were conducting inspections just the way that they would do it within the United States. Now, if you look at the kind of inspections that they do, and most recently, I don't know if you pay attention to this or not, but about 2.5 weeks ago, there was news that a company in Gujarat, during inspection, the US FDA inspectors found a truck full of shredded documents during the inspection. It's recorded there because they make the inspection reports public. The point I'm trying to make here is that they changed the way that they actually inspect. It's become a lot more forensic right now. That essentially is an activity to try and compensate for where they thought they were lacunae, right? They thought we are actually falling short in this space. We're going to try and make changes to it. They revised the law. They got it approved through the Senate. It became law. The US FDA got additional funding for foreign inspections. All of this stuff happened. I went in 2014, before the PIL that we filed in the Supreme Court, I actually went and tried to meet with Dr. Harshvardhan, who was the health minister there. He basically wasn't interested. He basically, just gave me a run around and said, okay, write me a report and send it to me, and I did. And that was the end of it. What my problem is that, there is nobody to engage with. I mean, other than the Parliamentary Standing Committee that did the work in 2012, which was a stellar piece of work, I can't find somebody who's willing to engage with it. It's fine, okay, you don't have to agree with what we are saying. And the reason why we wrote this book was because we wanted to put the data out there. We don't draw any conclusions other than the last chapter where we make policy kind of recommendations. The rest of it is pure data, and we try to connect the dots for you. You don't have to agree with what I say or Prashant says, but at least have a conversation, right? Threatening people is not the way to try and have a conversation. Alienating people by issuing threats and calling people anti-national just because you don't agree with them, that's not the right way to try and actually have a conversation. And that's where my challenge is.
And if I can just add, there was one bureaucrat, do you want? There was one bureaucrat in the Ministry of Health, the Joint Secretary heading this drug regulation section, who did engage with Dinesh. We had submitted a lengthy report to him. It's a gentleman called K.L. Sharma, who's also written a book called Healing the World's Pharmacy. It's available on Amazon if you guys are interested. So he did engage with Dinesh. He did carry out a few changes, and he was then immediately transferred in his last year of service to the National Commission for Women, which was seen as a punishment posting. So the system basically, it closes in to protect from external scrutiny. And that's not the case in the US. I mean, there is a lot of lobbying. The US Congress is also maybe perhaps a bit corrupt. But you do see visible change over there, especially when people die, when children die, there will be changes in those countries. We have somehow become immune to even kids dying. That's the scary part.
So I'd just like to address the part about, what you brought up about, is it like this in India versus the US? One of the big changes that happened with COVID was the kind of conversations we started having as groups of physicians and clinicians across the world. So early days of COVID, there wasn't really much data for us to rely on. We were relying on WhatsApp groups of doctors from across the world. It really opened up channels of communication, also made us aware of the similar problems that exist with our colleagues in Brazil or in China. We're not the only country with this problem. There are large countries where, again, the matter of this is about nationalism over public health. These other countries face these challenges too. I do think that what I really admire about what I found amazing about your book was that in every chapter, as you bring to light many of the irregularities, you also put forward suggestions. I do think that there are groups of citizens, public health activists, doctors, researchers all across India, and more recently, much more importantly, a lot more health journalists who are bringing these conversations out in a way that I think we are going to be working towards healing the pharmacy of the world into becoming a high quality pharmacy. I mean, right now, we're the pharmacy of the world, yes, but we want to be a better pharmacy, not just to the world, but for our own country too, right? So I think there are some signals of positive, changes that are happening.
I'm just going to say that we've seen more conversations during and after COVID than I have seen in my entire career. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Could you please switch off your phone.
Yeah, my name is Dennis Xavier. I'm a professor of pharmacology at St. John's Medical College. Three things very quickly, in the interest of time. One, I've not yet read the book, but I've heard a lot about it, and thank you and congratulations. That's the first thing. We need more such, initiatives from, people like you. That's number one. Number two, maybe in a point of optimism, point well taken about, where doctors get their information from and how they deal with it. About 25 years ago, I did a little study on where doctors get their information from. It was the medical rep who came, and I think it has not changed much. Now I'm happy to tell you, I trained at McMaster University in Canada, the place where evidence-based medicine came up, and I engaged with them. In a few days, I'm going to conduct the 14th annual course on evidence-based medicine at St. John's. A point of optimism to in the evening, A lot of people love it. In fact, Gordon Guyatt, who coined the term evidence-based medicine, teaches live at this course, and we engage with him. Lots of people are interested, they want to learn, but I get the point that Dr. Jagdish Chinappa made about funding for research. For the majority of people, it's a big challenge. Again, a point of optimism, the Indian government is putting in lots of money now compared to even 5 or 8 years back. Huge amounts of funding being there, but extremely, extremely competitive to get it. I sit on review committees and I see the number of applications coming. So things are moving, with some amount of optimism. So the final thing is maybe a question for you. Maybe if you could summarize the last chapter in your book, which is recommendations, and again for us to, sorry, maybe a tall ask, but maybe a couple of things for us to, we all know the problem. We all know the problem and how batch to batch variation there is and how we struggle with that. And I kept. I sit on our drugs and therapeutics committee as well, and doctors keep asking, Dennis, can you tell us how do we test it? It's so complex. It's very difficult, and I say this is how we need to do it, and it's so expensive, and that's why it never gets done, right? So maybe we could, if you could, share with us on how things can improve going forward beyond writing books like this. Thank you.
There's a list of a lot of, I think, very boring suggestions, because a lot of this policy reform is, I'm sorry, inherently boring for a general audience. But the one recommendation that we've been making consistently is to try and democratize regulation a lot more. So, for example, exercise the right to information, right? So make the system a lot more transparent so that, doctors like you or activists, academics have easy access to information, because that's one way of keeping tabs on even the government drug inspector. Like if you make public an inspection report of a manufacturing facility, even if you have certain redactions to protect confidential information, you at least know that the inspector has gone and done the inspection. Right now, we don't even know whether that guy is inspecting the facility. And the moment the bureaucrat knows that his name is going to be out there publicly, there may still be some corruption, but he will do 80% of the job at least. The other aspect of democratizing regulation is to create avenues for people to participate in regulation, right? So for example, in the US, a lot of drug approvals they're conducted in the open. Outside doctors can participate. There are formal mechanisms where citizens can petition the regulator to raise issues with them. We have sent countless petitions in Dinesh's name to the Ministry of Health. We've not even got an acknowledgement. Like, forget action taken on that particular thing. So we need to really we need to rethink regulation as something that is not just a compact between the industry and government. The citizenry does have a role to play in it. So when we're redesigning, there is a plan afoot to create a new law, etc., for regulation. They just copied the old law, made it a little bit worse, and they published it for comments. And I think only the both of us were writing about it in the press. No one else seemed to have been writing about it. But we need to, I think, pressure, especially from doctors, can make all the difference. And we say this based on history, like we studied, one of the reasons we went into so much depth on how the Drugs Act 1940 came into being when we were a colonized country, was to understand what were the politics at that time. And it was a lot of doctors who were pushing for it, and pharmacologists. The father of Indian pharmacology, Colonel Chopra. So I hope that if the medical community does get involved in this process, it pushes the government to ensure there's a more transparent, more participative system, so that we're not left to the mercy of the bureaucracy in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to just make one small comment over here about the way the process of regulation or finding out where things go wrong. If the entire approach in this is to find fault, blame somebody, and punish them, we're not going to fix the problem. Because it's usually not one person, it's a huge system change. And I find this as a problem even in large hospitals. When we talk about patient safety, people tend to underreport problems. There's fear amongst junior staff in reporting a problem because, if we fall in our quality ratings, then this affects things, right? You want to create an environment of safety. There needs to be an environment of safety for people within the pharmaceutical industry to call out when things are not okay. There needs to be that environment of safety in the regulators and all the staff in the regulators, just like there needs to be that environment of safety in hospital systems for nurses and therapists and medical students and residents to call out when something is not okay and to report facts as they are. Those data are to inform our reform process. They're not about losing ratings. These are not, gold stars to be won, and it's not school anymore. These are people's lives. So we really have to be looking at it as systemic reform, but that isn't how it is right now. The approach is punitive, where one person is punished. It's not looked at as a systemic error. We need risk management and patient safety to become subjects that people study and pursue actively in all these systems.
Hi, I'm Kamal Chabria.
Yeah, please step up to the mic.
Is it clear? Is it better?
Just step up to the mic.
Hi, I'm Kamal Chabria. So I run a business into corporate events. I'm nowhere connected to medical industry. I just come here to watch theaters, but I saw your lot of information I got. It's very nice. I just had this quick question. I'm like an end user, so I go to gym. I have my personal trainer. I have my personal nutritionist, and whenever I fall sick, when I go to a doctor, when they prescribe some kind of medicines, when I go to a nutritionist, she recommends some kind of supplements of plant-based supplements like protein powders, then some tablets. That also looks like tablet. She also hates these pharmaceutical medicine products. So when I go to the doctor, when I show these things that I'm using these supplements, even doctor says that don't use these supplements because this might harm your body. So I don't really understand which one to take, whether to supplements or the pharmaceutical medicines. So I just wanted to ask you, and since you also kind of not lacking towards the pharmaceutical, so do you promote the supplements?
No. No, don't do that. You can get the professional medical opinion from Dr. Bhat, but let me just tell you that a lot of the supplement
and
stuff...
she's a certified nutritionist who recommends me.
Yeah, I'm sure she is, but a lot of the supplement industry in India is not regulated at all. Okay. Like if you think, like pharma, there is regulation, it's bad regulation, but the supplement industry is not regulated at all. And I've heard anecdotal, evidence from a lot of doctors that a lot of the supplements are loaded with all kinds of stuff. But over to Dr. Bhat for the professional opinion.
So if we're concerned about the regulation in the pharmaceutical industry, as Prashant said, I'm even more concerned about the lack of regulation in the nutraceutical is the word these days, right? It's called the nutraceutical industry. Just as I am deeply concerned about the lack of regulation in the traditional systems of medicine. One, if we were talking about at least there being some process of testing certain batches to say that there is only 23 milligrams in place of 200 milligrams in a tablet, there is absolutely nothing in the nutraceutical or the traditional medicine industry. As part of my interest in public health, I've visited places I've visited non-profit organizations which are about livelihood and things like that. And it's not that difficult to get a license to manufacture certain products which are meant to be food supplements in the traditional systems of medicine. So if I go into one of their manufacturing units, what I will typically find is a pill crushing machine where you have vitamin B12 bought as a generic from somewhere, along with some herbal powders. A pill crushing machine crushes the B12 powder, which you could get from the pharmaceutical, from the pharmacy directly, mixes it in with something else. It's a random combination. So I don't even know how many micrograms of B12 ended up in the nutritional supplement, natural supplement that you got then. So it's very unregulated. I can't comment on it at all. And that's the reason why your doctor tells you, I don't know what else is in this in addition to that supplement. I don't know what binders and mixers they've used. So if you're not well and I'm giving you a medication, I have no way of knowing about the drug-drug interactions, which may reduce the efficacy of the other medicines I'm giving you. That's the reason why I'm saying, why a doctor is telling you, don't use these while I'm giving you other medicines. We have no way of knowing what's going to happen with the interaction there.
I think it's a subject for another investigative book.
Thank you very much. You mentioned evidence-based medicine as well as social determinants of health. So as a statistician, I would like to understand, how does one establish the causality between deaths and intake of medicine? Because establishing causality, I mean, one incident taking place, I mean, it's a big coincidence, Uzbekistan and Gambia, however unfortunate it might be. So that might be a bit, that's one story. Regulatory, quality of regulation is one story, but it's a big coincidence that those things happening, because establishing causality is different. And one of the reasons why Pfizer didn't enter the COVID vaccine market in India was because of it didn't want to take up the responsibility, the liability clause. So could you please help me understand? Thank you.
Perhaps you should simply mention the process of how the PGI Chandigarh established the causality of death in the cough medicine.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, with cough syrup, it was relatively easy to establish the causality because you could see how the chemical affected the kidneys, etc., and test for the presence of the contaminant. But you're right, for most of NSQ medicine, that is not a standard quality medicine, actually establishing causality is very, very difficult. So, which is why a lot of times even doctors will not be able to, put down treatment failures to the medicine. So, which is all the more reason that you need to get your regulatory act together, because finding out this causality and filing, say, adverse event forms with the regulator is very, very difficult for a lot of medicine in India which doesn't work. For example, if an antibiotic is working only at 50% or your diabetes drug has degraded to a certain extent, at most what the doctor will do is switch out your brands, because proving that causality is too expensive a process, and most of the times it will not happen. So unless there is death, when there is death, or for example in these eye drops cases when the patients lost their eyesight, those are cases where you can establish causality. But otherwise it's very difficult.
I absolutely agree. It's very difficult to establish causality. I would like to mention one doctor in particular who's been very active in trying to isolate and pinpoint where causality is, and he is a hepatologist from Kerala who, whenever he has a patient with acute liver injury or acute liver failure, will really go into the patient's medicine box and send out everything that they are taking for testing to the state labs.
A lot of them are supplements.
So his name is Dr. Syriac Abbey Philip, and he's been a crusader in many ways about really, calling for more reform on this count.
I've been told we can take one final question, so we'll close with you, sir.
Thanks a lot. Great admirer of Mr. Dinesh. I'm a pharmacy graduate and I worked in a pharmaceutical company 25 years back. Now working in a cancer hospital, so on the other side. I have myself faced audits in the manufacturing side. So I just wanted to understand, and in the law, is there a change? Because at that time, I think every audit was kind of well in advance planned. Everybody was informed. The look and feel of the entire organization used to change during the audit times. A replacement of whatever you can think of. So is the system same, or is some suo moto, like a audit, is some power there in the system now?
Are you asking this question in the context of
Indian?
Indian? Okay.
Yeah.
We don't know. because unfortunately, the drug regulator doesn't tell us how they conduct our audit, when they conduct audit, what have they found during the audit. None of that is public, right? So I have no idea how to answer the question you're asking.
So most probably nothing changed.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
On that optimistic note, we must close this evening. I just want to say thank you to three of you for a remarkable discussion, and to two of you especially for writing this book. I think what we in India need is books like this on a variety of sectors. That will these are things we really lack in India. And if you could think of perhaps doing your next book, we'd be very interested to hear.
It depends on how many people buy this book.
So please go out and get it, and they're available to sign it. Thank you again.
I join Samar in saying thank you for writing this book, and also for all the talks that you are conducting in so many parts of India in multiple languages. Thank you for just making this information more accessible.
And thank you, Samar and Dr. Bhat, for helping with the conversation today.